Chapter 18. An Island Feast. The Best Kind of Potato. Buteyko's Adventures Among the Academicians. It was about 3 o'clock when they landed on the island. May was unusually warm that year, and most of the Gulf of Ob was already clear of ice. Now Dr Buteyko was not only a remarkable scholar, but also a very generous person. He would work 15-hour days and inspire his staff by his example. When he was minded to take a break, however, he would arrange things so that his closest comrades-in-arms could take time off with him, and they put the same energy and commitment into relaxing as they put into their work. No one felt awkward in their company. The doctor in no way made his authority felt. Unlike Professor Pomekin, who would puff out his cheeks self-importantly, his very appearance warning his subordinates not to put a foot out of line. As Natalia Voronova and the rest of the island trippers gathered dry kindling for the fire, she remembered amidst their loud chatter how they had celebrated New Year the previous winter. They'd hung an enormous homemade newspaper on the wall of Dr Buteyko's living room. In the middle, the artists among them had drawn a silhouette of the doctor, equipping him with an unusually large pair of glasses. Each lens contained small passport photos of all the staff who worked in the lab and whose dynamic enthusiasm enabled it to survive despite the pressures it was under. Half the newspaper was taken up with handwritten tongue-in-cheek descriptions of the party guests' dreams, imaginary of course, as the new year approached. These dreams centered around one theme, with individual variations. Well, they wrote, 1964 is here, and Konstantin Buteyko has been awarded the Nobel Prize. As for his humble servants, they, and he of course, have at long last been assigned a whole separate block, a sort of sanatorium, in place of the tiny cramped room that has been doing service as a lab. Which means their poor patients are no longer cooped up in tiny lodgings, but luxuriate in comfortable single-occupancy rooms. They live like human beings and are medically supervised, in the Buteyko sense, of course, not just for a set number of minutes at their appointment, but round the clock. Let's be clear, even in their dreams, the doctor's colleagues didn't envisage hospital wards. Like Buteyko himself, they were opposed to bed-bound medical treatment. No, what they had in mind was a real sanatorium complex, complete with sports halls, a wonderful clinic with all the latest equipment, a sauna, and even a swimming pool. When Buteyko finished reading their newspaper, far from putting on airs or setting himself above them as mere mortals, he raised a glass of champagne and said quietly and simply, "My friends, this is all actually very important. God grant one day it comes true, even if only so far as a sanatorium's concerned." The doctor was aware how little his colleagues earned. Often he would keep the greater part of his own salary in an unlocked desk drawer in his tiny office. He regularly told his colleagues that anyone who needed to could take money out of the drawer until payday, leaving a note saying when they would repay it. Professor Pomekin probably wouldn't have countenanced doing such a thing even in his worst nightmare, despite the fact that there was no comparison between his own income as director and the money Buteyko earned as head of laboratory, kept ruthlessly low by Pomekin. Buteyko shared his last kopeck, but not because he was rich. Rather, he was prepared to cut his own requirements to the minimum for the sake of his great project. It was a stance which impacted more forcefully than any rhetoric. The fish soup they cooked up over the campfire of crackling twigs was excellent. But Dr Buteyko, the angler-in-chief, Kolya and Dima had helped with the catch, took just a taste of it. He preferred the potatoes they'd baked in the fire. After all, according to his theory, fish was even more harmful to health than meat. It should be said, however, that the author of the discovery of diseases of deep breathing had never stuck to any absolutely rigid rules about food. When he was in the company of others, Buteyko would eat anything. What's important is that it doesn't become a habit, he liked to say on such occasions. Marina, however, who was sitting on a small tree stump to the left of her husband and holding a camping bowl tucked into enough soup for the two of them. Do ballerinas not worry about their waistlines? This apparently innocent remark was delivered with a wide smile by round-faced Dr Buteyko, who hadn't managed to get rid of her own small paunch, even using the method. "My dear Dr Buteyko," replied Mrs. Buteyko, casting an icy look at the undone lower buttons on the lightweight lilac jacket, tightly encasing Dr. Bubentsova's sloping shoulders. "It won't take me long in the gym to wash away this particular sin. You see, I can't afford to just rely on breathing." She tailed off into a meaningful silence. Everyone there knew perfectly well that anyone who practised the method conscientiously would shed excess weight. Dr. Bubentsova's undone buttons were a source of involuntary mirth to many of those sitting eating with her in the semicircle round the fire. "Here's to our victory," declared Collier, the lab technician, laying aside his aluminium soup bowl and setting about refilling their plastic beakers with champagne. He enjoyed playing the master of ceremonies. The Buteykoites took alcohol extremely rarely, but this was their preferred tipple. The doctor was of the opinion that champagne was only half harmful, since it contained a great deal of CO2. "We've already toasted the holiday," said Collier, handing a beaker to Natalia Voronova and almost spilling the foaming liquid over her dark blue tracksuit-trousered knees. "Now here's to the publication of the official handbook and its long and successful career." Everyone stretched out to clink glasses. Collier, like an idiot, went so far as to suggest to Natalia's husband that they drink a Bruderschaft toast with interlinked arms. A light, refreshing breeze gusted in off the sea. The springtime Siberian sun warmed them gently. As usual on such occasions, the conversation gradually turned to general themes. The bearded Dima, Collier's inseparable workmate, spoke up, picking up a well-baked potato with a stick as he did so. "We'll leave the subject of women till later, of course." Natalia choked on her soup and spluttered into her fist. "But meanwhile, what about politics? National politics, maybe. Maybe with an agricultural slant," he added quickly, to reassure the members of the fair sex, who'd immediately pricked up their ears. He tossed back his greasy hair and held the charred, smoking potato up higher. "This potato, for example. A straightforward bit of nosh, or so you'd think. But it's actually getting quite rare." Everyone stared at him in astonishment. "That's right," he continued unabashed, taking off his jacket and explaining what he meant. "You won't get your hands on a potato like this one just any old where. You see, it's not been done to death with chemicals. I bought it specially from an old woman I know at the market. She's got a small kitchen garden in Yeltsovka, and so far she hasn't poisoned it with mineral fertilizers. The Central Committee of the Communist Party recently published a paper about an even greater increase in production of mineral fertilizers and chemicals for protecting plants." Dima peeled the steaming potato and salted it generously. "It said that any enterprises failing the country in this regard would be penalized." "What's your opinion, Dr. Buteyko?" Dima winked at Collier, who had been trying to get hold of the other half of the delicious potato on the quiet. The doctor didn't need to be asked twice. Everyone knew he was a passionate champion of natural, unadulterated food. He took a sip from his mug of freshly brewed tea and answered, "I'll tell you this much. For all this 7-year plan envisages a significant increase in chemical production, no good at all will come of using non-organic fertilizers." He blew on the hot drink. "My grandfather in the Ukraine, who'd no real education, never polluted his land with any chemicals at all. He used to tie the ripened grain into sheaves unthreshed, just as it was, and keep it like that in the barn. It would keep for years without getting eaten by maggots. Not like nowadays." The doctor put his mug down on the grass. "The minute they're harvested, they get down to threshing and refining the grain, and it rots in the corn bins in the wink of an eye. First it gets poisoned with chemicals, then on top of that it gets stripped prematurely of its protective casing. What else can it do but rot away from sheer grief? That's why we don't have more in the way of bread reserves, because we don't know how to store the grain." Buteyko tightened the tasselled ties on his red-fringed smock. "Mark my words," he continued, pointing at Dima, "the time will come when people will be falling over themselves to get food grown by traders like that old granny you know. And since there won't be enough grannies to go round, our old friend shallow breathing will still be the best way of avoiding being done to death by chemicals. After all, it even counteracts poisoning." Buteyko screwed up his eyes, thinking. "The trouble is, the professors and academicians just cannot understand its benefits, despite all my efforts to explain it to them. That's why they'll be the first to start dying off." "Dr Buteyko, tell us about the adventures you had when you went the rounds of the academicians," said Dr Bubentsova. Her jacket was feeling much too tight now, and she unbuttoned it completely. "It's such an interesting story." "You don't want to talk shop on a holiday, do you?" Buteyko replied, trying to get out of it. But they set about persuading him so hard he was soon forced to give in. "Okay, have it your way," he said, finally capitulating. "I'll tell you, since you're so interested. But it wasn't just academicians I went to see. It was professors, too." He massaged his leg, which had gone numb from sitting on a hard log for so long. "I've been trailing round them for years now, before I got my PhD and afterwards. Whenever I went on a research trip, to Moscow maybe, or Leningrad, I'd call in on one of the leading lights in the field. I had every faith in real scholars. I've still a bit left even now," the doctor said, with ill-concealed bitterness. "At first I tried to do things via the Ministry of Health, to stick to protocol. With some difficulty I managed to get a letter prepared by our institute asking for help in organising a trial of the method, and in the end I was sent with my letter to see the Academic Secretary of Medical Institute. Number 2. Buteyko pushed away a spruce twig that was poking him in the side. The secretary turned my letter this way and that. He twice read through all the proposals the institute management had drawn up. He even put it up to the light to look through it, checking in case it was some kind of forgery. "The only thing I can do," he said, "is recommend you go and see Bochal." He wrote me a note for him then and there. "He's our asthma specialist," he explained. "Head of department. He's the one who holds the cards." Well, I couldn't really object to that. What he said was true. Ilya Bochal was a renowned scholar. He'd published loads of stuff on pulmonary disease. Who better to see? So I took my note and went to the department. Now I'll be able to have a detailed discussion, I thought. The doctor threw a twig onto the crackling fire. But Bochal didn't even bother getting up from behind his desk to greet me. He gestured offhandedly towards an armchair opposite him and looked at me with deep suspicion. "So, you're Buteyko. Yes, we've heard of you. We know a bit about you already round these parts. You use breathing to treat people, is that not it?" he said rather sarcastically. But the odd thing was, he wasn't that healthy himself. When he was speaking, he made a whistling sound. Rumour had it he suffered from asthma, emphysema, and pulmonary fibrosis. The doctor tightly compressed his lips. "Anyway, the point is, our method could have dealt with a whole range of his problems." Buteyko touched the tip of his nose with 2 fingers. I told him about the basic tenets of the method. I explained how deep breathing test could very rapidly provoke an asthma attack, and I offered to test everything out properly in their clinic. That's what I said, but our conversation felt strained almost to breaking point. Bochal was looking at me in a way which was both exasperated and aloof, as if I was hopelessly insane. "The thing is," he replied, "it really wouldn't work here. We're so busy, we've masses of patients. You go and test everything out again yourselves, in your own place. Investigate the whole thing more thoroughly. It seems to me you're mistaken. There's something not right about it." "Forgive me," I said, deciding to try one last argument. "I've heard you yourself aren't well."
That's right," he admitted readily, without hesitation. "But I'll manage for myself for the moment. You may find it hard to believe, but I've my own ways of coping, without any method."
"Allow me to cure you," I suggested.
"Most grateful," he replied, "but I'm already coping. I'm used to it."
So the man's suffocating with asthma to this day, and he's tormenting his patients with his standard treatments. After that he sent me packing empty-handed. I felt that exasperated look of his boring into my back. Natalia Voronova leant over to her husband and whispered something in his ear. He nodded to show he'd understood, poured out some of the doctor's cold tea, and topped it up with water from the kettle.
"The next time I was in Moscow, I went to see another famous scholar," continued Buteyko, "academician Manukhin, one of the world's foremost physiologists, creator of various functional systems. My own scientific researches are based on some of them. I was hoping that surely this man would understand. I described in great detail cases of hypertension, angina, and asthma which had been cured by the method. I focused basically on hypertension and angina because he had hypertensive disease himself. I explained the mechanism of his condition as revealed by the discovery of the diseases of deep breathing, hyperventilation, vascular spasm, CO2 deficiency, hypoxia, in other words, the phenomena which occur in hypertensive patients. I also told him that I too had suffered from hypertension, serious malignant hypertension. I reminded him I'd studied under academician Daryev, so I'd specialized in the field of hypertension and that I was a clinician to boot. I went on to say I'd invented a method to combat this insidious disease by reducing the depth of breathing. No. Manukhin wasn't even going to let me finish. You carry on with your experiments, and meanwhile I'll take my American tablets. So that's all he had to say as far as he himself was concerned. The doctor shifted from the edge of the log to come nearer the fire. As for the method, you carry on testing it out, he said. There's something not right about it. Dima, who was sitting not far from the doctor, gave an eloquent click of the tongue. Check it out again, and more than just once, because it can't be true. It's not right. I repeated what I'd said to Botchel. Allow me to cure you. But no, came the reply. With some effort, Buteyko broke a long, thick branch and angrily threw it beyond the fire. And you know what? The man died from a stroke soon after. To think he refused to listen to me. Tell us about academician Lapshin, Doctor. It was Bubentsova again, although she was probably well acquainted with Buteyko's adventures amongst the academicians. Buteyko had intended to say no more, but now resumed animatedly. Oh, Igor Lapshin, yes, that took the biscuit. But let's finish the Manukhin story first. He didn't give me a proper hearing on that occasion, but he did put my report up for discussion at a conference for physiologists in Moscow. You'll never believe this, though. The doctor slapped his knee. He chickened out of attending the conference himself. It turned out someone had already been leaking much of what I was planning to Professor Permyakin. Buteyko gave his wife a sidelong glance, and she quickly turned away. And Permyakin had managed to really get the wind up Manukhin. He told him a schizophrenic was coming to see him with some crazy idea about the benefits of carbon dioxide and to be very wary of him. At this, Marina pulled her red scarf down practically over her eyes. She obviously wasn't enjoying her husband's veiled hints. Whatever you do, don't argue with him, Permyakin had told him. The doctor was closely observing his wife, who half bowed her head. He pressed his advantage. They say he's dangerous. God knows when he's overexcited he could cut your throat. Well, poor Manukhin was so terrified he didn't dare to be the one to oppose me at the conference in case I clouted him right there on the podium, said Buteyko, smiling ruefully, his mood darkening. Instead, he put his pet pupil Vetlovsky into the ring to face me. The doctor's island listeners smiled. What sort of pet pupil gets sent to the slaughter? They sacrificed him, answered Buteyko, taking a sip from his mug of tea, which had again gone cold. But Vetlovsky hadn't a clue what I was talking about. That's why they'd put him up against me. So he'd just sweep the whole thing aside without even examining it. Shikman was also in the hall. Permyakin had dispatched him to the conference as a matter of urgency. Shikman's the one who at one point was removed, not without some assistance from myself, from his post as head of the physiological laboratory because of his lack of diagnostic talent. He was busying himself among the rows of delegates, warning people not to believe the blatant nonsense I was presenting. The doctor spat disgustedly. Despite it all, I presented my full report to the physiologists in due order. They were really beginning to panic. It was impossible to object to what I said. Everything seemed entirely legitimate. They couldn't even find any details to quibble over. Even Professor Vetlovsky, who was the departmental second-in-command, sensed he'd bungled his mission. He didn't even allow me any concluding remarks. Well, my friends, the whole thing's just incomprehensible from start to finish. It's unbelievable. He'd begun just spouting phrases to get shot of me. But the key thing was, no opinions were voiced and no objections. Buteyko got up from the log he'd been sitting on, because they hadn't expected to be so knocked off course. I'd shown them the graphs, I'd shown them the interrelationships, all the formulae for the diseases, the mathematical formulae showing how vascular spasms are related to CO2 levels, things they'd never seen before, the opposite of what they'd been taught.
The doctor waved a hand bitterly and made as if to go back to the fishing rods left on the shore, but Asya and Galia, two feisty lab technicians, caught him by the sleeve of his sailcloth jacket. "Sit down, Dr. Buteyko, sit down. Tell us some more about this medical mafia. You've no time when you're working. When else will we get the chance to hear it?" Buteyko succumbed to Galia, a dark-eyed Ukrainian, and reluctantly sat down. "I can't even get to fish in peace with you lot around," he said, trying to laugh things off with a gentle reproach, and casting a longing glance towards the lure of the smooth, deep blue water. "Well, all right, listen some more, if you're so keen. I actually did the rounds of a great many professors and academicians, about 20 or so. I couldn't tell you about them all, even if I took 2 days over it." "That's okay, we're in no hurry," said Galia, tossing a heavy braid over her shoulder. "But in any case, I never talk about all of them. I usually tell people about 5, Bochal, Manakhin, Lapshin, Chuganov, and General Sharatsky. The royal flush," said the doctor, spreading the fingers on his right hand. "Apart from Manakhin and Lapshin, who are dead now, they all work in different institutes, and for the most part in different specialisms, but they waged war on me as if by common consent." Frowning, Buteyko adjusted his glasses, which were threatening to slip down. "And along with me, thousands of patients who still can't be treated with the method thanks to those ace medical dive-bombers. Because getting the discovery of the diseases of deep breathing and the volitional elimination of deep breathing introduced into general practice depends on those big shots and their ilk, more's the pity. They're at the controls." Behind his glasses, the doctor's pale grey-blue eyes narrowed to barely perceptible slits, perhaps in reaction to the sun's slanting rays. "You mentioned academician Lapshin," he said, turning to Dr. Bubentsova, whose face was rosy from the fresh air. "Yes." He became thoughtful for a moment. "Igor Lapshin is a shining example of how the self-appointed conservative establishment battles against the method and damages itself in the process. If you remember, Svetlana, we began trialling the method not for asthma, but basically for hypertension and angina." Bubentsova nodded in agreement. "But at the moment they're trying to fight us with regard to asthma only. They're not even taking the rest of it into account. And you and the lads here," he indicated Kolya and Dima, who were sitting with their arms round each other, "well remember the furore that caused in the lab." "You're telling me—" Kolya took his prominently veined arm away from Dima's neck. "Getting asthmatics to use shallow breathing is 10 times harder than getting hypertensive patients to do it. Asthmatics are gasping for breath the whole time as it is, and then you go and tell them not to breathe." "Oh, exactly. I was just coming to that," Buteyko chimed in eagerly. "We didn't switch from hypertensive patients to asthmatics right at the outset of our ambitious project for fun. It would have been much more sound and significantly easier to start by gathering a stack of positive data on hypertensive and angina patients, and only afterwards try conquering the higher peaks. But as we battled against hypertension and angina using the method, academician Lapshin and that whole school of thought, which dominates the entire country, stood resolutely in our way, an insurmountable obstacle." The doctor's face darkened. "To them we were interfering with their birthright. They set the bar so high, I realized we'd have to try to clear a path for the method using just asthmatics. It was a much more difficult enterprise, but, on the other hand, it did provide a very clear model. If a patient reduced his depth of breathing, even the severest attack would simply disappear. It was plain for all to see. Hypertension, on the other hand, well, just try demonstrating that as clearly. If the patient got a bit agitated and, of course, immediately started over-breathing, his blood pressure would soar. Then try proving it was a stress reaction, especially to people who don't want to see the evidence. Anyway, the asthma focus that was forced on us certainly gave us a lot of grief to begin with. There was a full-blown rebellion in the lab. It's difficult making people breathe through their noses when they're used to gulping air in through their mouths like a fish. Patients were fleeing our hallowed walls in terror." Buteyko's eyes grew rounder. "They're all mad in there," they said. "Here we are, suffocating as it is, and they tell us to reduce our breathing." They carried on running away until I got really angry and ordered that from then on every patient, without exception, was to be given a deep breathing test at the outset. He laughed loudly.
And when they'd had their fill of that wonderful experience, they stopped taking us for lunatics. In fact, I had a bigger struggle with the staff," he continued, looking again at Dima and Kolya and Dr. Bubentsova, who was sitting in front of them. You see, the method was wonderfully suited to hypertension and angina. However, taking Lapshin's opposition as symptomatic, I was now absolutely sure that Western medicine, damn it to hell, was in the grip of the dread hand of decay. As a rule, Buteyko's hand chopped down through the air, all its leading specialists suffer from the same condition they're the illustrious experts in. Not so long ago, Lapshin attended an international medical convention on combating, preventing and anticipating arteriosclerosis and heart attack. While he was there, he was given an International Golden Stethoscope Award in his capacity as the leading scholar in the field, renowned the world over for his diagnostic skill and his unsurpassed identification of the onset of heart attack. He went back to Moscow. He bragged about his award. Shortly afterwards, he died in his own clinic from his 5th unrecognized heart attack. Need I say more? In Buteyko's voice, evident sorrow at his colleague's untimely death mingled with real bitterness. So what's going on here? People, intelligent people, develop a chronic condition in their youth. For understandable reasons, they choose to go to medical school. They pay particular attention to studying the factors most closely associated with their own ailment. In time, they become leading lights in precisely that field. But of course, since they rely on the traditions of Western primarily pills and injection medicine, which basically treats the results rather than the cause, they're unable to relieve their own suffering. That's why their unfortunate patients get equally successful treatment in the course of their noble enterprise. These people are ill themselves. They can't cure themselves. They gag anyone who strays from the traditional path, even though they may actually be successfully combating the disease. And they themselves are dying of the very condition they've studied in depth, Buteyko concluded sarcastically. My meetings with Professor Chuganov and General Sharatsky in Leningrad merely confirmed me in that unhappy conclusion. But we'll leave that for later, said the doctor, buttoning his jacket decisively. I see the sun's already setting, he declared in a quite different tone. Come on, folks, into the boats.